Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to be back in the Chamber. It's the first time for nearly 5 months that I've appeared physically rather than virtually, and much as I long to see Scotland regain its independence, I recognise that this is one of the great debating chambers of the world, and it's always a privilege to speak here. And it's also a pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for South West Wiltshire, who speaks so knowledgeably about matters of public health. Since the last Queen's speech in December 2019, the 4 constituent parts of the United Kingdom have been through very tumultuous times. The United Kingdom left the European Union on the 31st of January 2020, but the pandemic almost eclipsed the end of the transition period at the tail end of last year. But that doesn't mean to say that traders haven't felt the pain of being out of the single market and the customs union, particularly in the Scottish fishing industry. As a result of the pandemic, many of our constituents have suffered grievous loss or serious illness. Others have suffered the associated health, social and economic impacts caused by the necessity of lockdown. And in many ways, the elderly have suffered most. At the outset, there was the terrible death toll in care homes, but elderly people have also suffered from the pain of being unable to see their loved ones at a time when their society and guidance was most needed. But of course, young people have suffered too the disruption of their education and their social lives, and mental health has been greatly impacted. Jobs have been lost and businesses, particularly small businesses, have struggled. The pandemic has indeed exacerbated the inequalities which already existed in our society, and I was disappointed to see no acknowledgement of this in the Queen's speech. At the very least, I would have expected to hear confirmation of measures to address the September cliff edge on furlough. Yes, things might be going well at the moment, but we cannot assume that they will always go well in relation to the virus. I'd also like to have seen measures to address the cliff edge and self-employed support, the reduced hospitality VAT, and also the £20 uplift universal credit. It's also very disappointing to see no measures to end unfair 0 hours and fire and rehire contracts, nor to deliver a real living wage for all. Citizens Advice Scotland have reminded us that the last year shows how vital our social security safety net is. But universal credit doesn't feature in the government's legislative agenda, and this risks missing lessons from the pandemic. While universal credit survived the influx of new claimants, in part by easing verification procedures and conditionality, fundamental aspects of its design have continued to put people in hardship, and they will continue to do so unless we reform them. Reform is urgently needed in that department. Now, in the Queen's speech, the government say children must have the best start in life, but this will not happen unless we tackle the scourge of child poverty, and I would like to have seen some outlining of measures to do that. The British Government might do well to take a leaf out of the Scottish Government's book. The Scottish Government established a Scottish child payment in the last Parliament and are committed to double it in this next Parliament, and child poverty campaigners have described that as a game changer. Can the UK Government match that sort of commitment? I wonder. And likewise, I'm sure people in England will be disappointed to still see no concrete plans for social care. Again, the British Government might do well to take a leaf out of the Scottish Government's book. The SNP election manifesto pledged to take forward the recommendations of the independent Feely review and to establish a national care service for Scotland in this current parliamentary term. It will oversee the delivery of care and improve standards in care homes, as well as improving training and, importantly, staff pay and conditions for our care workforce. And also it will give support to unpaid carers. Madam Deputy Speaker, that's the kind of concrete action that led to the SNP winning a historic 4th election victory last week. And this brings me to the Constitution. The British Government say they want to strengthen and renew democracy. Those were the words used in the Queen's speech. They want to strengthen and renew democracy and the Constitution and strengthen the integrity of elections. Well, they would do well to start by respecting the outcome of the election that we had in Scotland last week. As I said, it was a historic fourth election victory in a row for the SNP, won with a record 47.7% share of the vote and on a record turnout. And it was won on a very firm manifesto commitment to deliver a second independence referendum. And it's no use the benches opposite arguing otherwise, as the Conservative and Unionist Party in Scotland put preventing a second independence referendum at the heart of their campaign and have ended up with only 21.9% of the vote and 32 seats. The SNP have twice as many. And together with the Greens, who got 8 seats in Scotland and who also had a firm manifesto commitment to deliver a second independence referendum, the pro-independence referendum parties in the Scottish Parliament now have 72 seats to the 57 of the anti-independence referendum parties. And of course that was the position in 2011, the exact same position, 72 seats to 57, when David Cameron came to the negotiating table and negotiated with Alex Salmond an agreement to hold an independence referendum. Now, I know the British government have said to date that we can't have another independence referendum because we had one 7 years ago, and it's worth pausing to note that we're not saying we want one immediately, we want one after the pandemic is over. But the British government would do well to listen to the former senior civil servant Kieran Martin, who oversaw the delivery of the Edinburgh Agreement in 2012 and who is now a professor at the University of Oxford. And he said last month that if the independence parties, pro-independence parties in Scotland, won another majority, there would be no legitimate justification on which to resist a referendum. And he is, of course, correct. And I would remind the benches opposite that in 2019, in the general election, the current Prime Minister secured an 80-seat majority on just 43.6% of the vote, considerably less than my party secured last week in percentage terms. And that result, he has been used by the Conservative and Unionist Party to justify far-reaching consequences for all of us in the United Kingdom, altering both the nature of the Union and relations with our neighbours radically. So what's sauce for the goose, Madam Deputy Speaker, is sauce for the gander. Now, of course, the Scottish Government has a plan to initiate legislation for a second independence referendum in the Scottish Parliament, regardless of whether or not the Prime Minister gives us a Section 30 order. And I'm very proud to have been instrumental in persuading my party to adopt that approach. But the Prime Minister should have the guts to come to the negotiating table, as David Cameron did in 2011, to ensure the referendum is held on an agreed basis. The Union of Scotland and England, Madam Deputy Speaker, is a union of consent. It is not a union enforced by force of law, and the British Prime Minister would do well to recognise that. Now, I want to say something positive about the proposals in the speech, because I'd like to give a cautious welcome to the Government's plans to protect freedom of speech. I wouldn't wish to give their plans unqualified support without hearing more about them, but I'm in no doubt that the Government have correctly identified that there's a problem with free speech in our universities, and I would welcome more public debate about it. The Joint Committee of Human Rights, of which I'm a member, identified issues with freedom of speech in our universities in a report which we issued in 2018. We didn't find the wholesale censorship of debate in universities, which media coverage has suggested, but we did find that there were issues and recommended some reforms. And I'm afraid since that report, the situation has got worse. For example, while society has worked hard to tackle sexual harassment, it is common now at universities across the United Kingdom for feminist academics who speak up for women's sex-based rights under the Equality Act to be harassed and threatened. And I've previously spoken on the floor of the House about the experiences of Professor Selina Todd, Professor Kathleen Stock and Professor Rosa Friedman. And I've just recently had brought to my attention, Madam Deputy Speaker, the case of a law student at a Scottish university who is facing a disciplinary investigation and the potential expulsion from her course for stating during a seminar that only women have vaginas, and for objecting to the statement that all men are rapists. Now, this woman's a final year mature law student, and she's undergoing this investigation and the threat of being thrown off her course in the middle of her final year while doing exam work. It is farcical, Madam Deputy Speaker, that a law student, a female mature law student, should be facing disciplinary action for stating a biological fact and challenging a sweeping statement. But the reality is that university authorities are under pressure from those who wish to silence feminist voices, and universities need support and encouragement to stand up against what can sometimes be very nasty and very threatening campaigns. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, when I say nasty and threatening, I know whereof I speak. But that's as far as my support for the government's legislative programme goes. And I would just want to point out to the government that there's no point in legislating to protect freedom of speech in universities, while at the same time legislating to undermine freedom of expression and assembly, as they are doing in the Police Crime and Sentencing at Courts Bill. And I would implore them to look at that afresh, to see what the all-party parliamentary groups on the law and the constitution and the rule of law are saying about that, and also the Joint Committee on Human Rights. Now, finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, looking to the international aspects of the Queen's speech, the government said that they want to uphold human rights and democracy across the world. Now, if they are really committed to doing that, then why does the government frequently fail to do that when it comes to the Palestinian people? The inaction from the international community, including the United Kingdom government, to properly defend and support Palestinians in the face of Israeli government and Israeli human rights abuses is not indicative of a country which supposedly centres human rights and democracy abroad. The excessive force used by Israeli forces on worshippers at Al-Aqsa and against families in Sheikh Jarrah in occupied East Jerusalem only prompts the mildest of criticism and zero consequences for those responsible. Those families, Madam Deputy Speaker, are facing forced transfer and dispossession of their homes, which would constitute a war crime. In the last 24 hours, we've seen a grim escalation with 24 people, including 9 children, killed in Israeli attacks on Gaza. And whilst we should rightly condemn the rocket attacks coming from Gaza to Jerusalem, we should also condemn and take action on the events that led up to these escalations and the excessive response to it. If the UK government really wants to be a human rights defender, then it should fully support the ICC's investigation into an alleged grave crime committed in the occupied Palestinian territory, and it shouldn't undermine it. So please, can we have real meaning to the words of upholding human rights and democracy abroad? Thank you, Madam President.